Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Olympic National Park, Washington State. June 17th, 2019. Thomas Anderson had been examining soil samples from the Hoh rainforest for 12 years, and he'd never seen mycorrhizal networks behave like this. The white filaments under his field microscope writhed with an urgency that violated everything his PhD from Oregon State had taught him about fungal growth rates. He adjusted the Leica DM500's magnification to 400x and watched as the hyphae extended 3 millimeters in less than 40 seconds. That was impossible. Armillaria ostoyi, the most aggressive fungus in the Pacific Northwest, managed perhaps 3 millimeters per day under optimal conditions. His Motorola XPR 755D crackled. "Tom, we need you at the ranger station, now." Chief Ranger Davidson's voice carried an edge Thomas had only heard twice before, both times involving fatalities. The drive from his field station took 23 minutes along the Hoh River Road. Thomas noticed the Douglas firs along the route seemed wrong somehow. Too dense, their lower branches reaching across the road where last week there'd been clear passage. His Garmin GPS map 64st showed his exact position, 47.860 Digran, 123.9348 Hordig W. The coordinates were correct, but the forest looked different. At the station, Davidson stood beside a woman Thomas didn't recognize. She sat wrapped in an emergency blanket despite the 71-degree indoors temperature his Kestrel 5500 weather meter displayed. Her ranger uniform was torn in precise parallel lines across the back, and something dark, sap maybe, had stained the fabric in patterns that reminded Thomas uncomfortably of Fibonacci spirals. "This is Rebecca Turner," Davidson said. "Fish and Wildlife Service. She was conducting spotted owl surveys near the Bogachiel River when..." He paused, choosing words carefully. "She was out there for 6 days. Her team reported her missing after she failed to check in. She walked out this morning." Thomas studied Rebecca's face. Burst capillaries created delicate patterns across her cheeks. Her pupils responded normally to light, but something in her expression suggested she was seeing beyond the immediate room. 6 days? Thomas kept his voice neutral. "The Bogachiel area is only 8 miles from here." Rebecca's head snapped toward him with mechanical precision. It wasn't 8 miles. Her voice had a peculiar quality, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. "The forest, it grows differently there. Grows wrong." Davidson handed Thomas a Canon EOS 5D Mark III. This was hers. The memory card's intact, but... He trailed off. Thomas scrolled through the images. The first dozen showed standard wildlife documentation, ISO 400, f5.6, the metadata indicated. Date stamp, June 11th, 1432. Then the photographs changed. June 12th, 0715, a western hemlock that appeared to be growing through the corpse of a Roosevelt elk. The tree's roots formed impossible geometries, weaving through the animal's body cavity in patterns that hurt to examine closely. June 12th, 1943, night shot with flash. Dozens of nurse logs covered in moss that glowed faintly blue-green. The bioluminescence was wrong. No Pacific Northwest fungi produced that wavelength. June 13th, 1022. Rebecca's own hand against a tree trunk for scale. The bark beneath showed fresh growth rings on the outside, as if the tree were growing backwards into itself. "The biological samples," Rebecca whispered. "Did anyone collect the samples?" Thomas exchanged glances with Davidson. "What samples?" She stood abruptly, the blanket falling away. Beneath her arms showed strange marks, not cuts, but indentations where something had grown into her skin and been removed. The patterns were precise, dendritic, like root systems. The ones growing from David and Casey. Davidson's expression tightened. "Rebecca, you were alone. Your team confirmed you went solo for the survey." Rebecca's laugh had no humor in it. "No, David Kemp and Casey Flores were with me. We entered together on June 11th at 800 hours. I have the sign-in log. She pulled a crumpled paper from her pocket. Thomas examined it. 3 signatures, proper format, dated correctly, but the station's database showed no records of David Kemp or Casey Flores. Not in Fish and Wildlife, not in the Park Service, nowhere in the federal employment system. "Show me where," Thomas said. Davidson started to object, but Thomas held up a hand. "I need soil samples from that area anyway. The mycological activity has been abnormal all season. If Rebecca can guide us to the specific location, it could explain the growth patterns I've been documenting." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I can take you, but we need proper equipment, Tyvek suits, respirators with B100 filters, and," she paused, "cutting tools, lots of cutting tools." June 18th, 2019, 05:45. Hours. Thomas met Rebecca at the Bogachil River trailhead. She'd refused medical evaluation, signing herself out AMA against Davidson's protests. In daylight, Thomas noticed details he'd missed before. Her hair had grown nearly 2 inches at the roots in stark white, despite being dark brown at the tips. Rapid growth after extreme stress was documented, but not in less than a week. She carried a steel MS-261 chainsaw along with standard pack gear. "You'll understand when we get there," she said, when Thomas questioned the equipment choice. They hiked in silence for the first mile. Thomas's GPS tracked their route precisely, but the forest seemed to shift around them. Trees he'd cataloged in previous surveys appeared in wrong positions, or showed growth that should have taken decades. At coordinates 47.9324 deground N, 124,018.79 W, Rebecca stopped. "Here. This is where we entered the affected zone." Thomas saw nothing unusual at first. Then his trained eye caught it. The undergrowth formed a nearly perfect circle, about 30 meters in diameter. Inside the circle, the vegetation was different. Not different species, the same plants, but wrong. Sword ferns with fronds that branched in impossible fractals. Salal bushes with leaves that grew in Mobius strips. Western red cedars with bark that spiraled in directions that seemed to violate 3-dimensional space. His Geiger counter, standard equipment since the Fukushima debris concerns, showed normal background radiation, 0.08 mSVH. The Field Scout TDR 350 soil moisture meter read 43%, optimal for the season. Nothing explained what he was seeing. "We need samples," Thomas said, pulling on nitrile gloves. "Don't touch them directly," Rebecca warned. "Use the grabbers, the 20-inch ones minimum." Thomas used telescoping forceps to collect specimens. The moment he severed a fern frond, it began growing in his sample container. Not healing, but extending new tissue at a rate visible to the naked eye. Within 30 seconds, it had pressed against the container walls. Growth rate approximately 1 centimeter per minute, he dictated to his phone's recorder. No visible energy source. Violates conservation of mass. The tissue appears to generate matter from somewhere else. Rebecca pointed deeper into the circle. "David and Casey are in there." Thomas followed her, noting how the air grew thick, not humid, but dense, as if packed with invisible material. His altimeter showed they'd descended 40 feet, but the terrain was level. Instrument malfunction had to be. They found the first body near what Thomas's GPS insisted was the center of the anomaly, though the device now showed their position jumping erratically within a 10-meter radius while they stood still. The remains were partially recognizable as human, male based on pelvic structure. But the body had been transformed. Branches grew from the chest cavity, not through it, but from it, as if the ribs had become wood, sprouting leaves that rustled without wind. The skull was intact but filled with what looked like mycelia, white threads emerging from eye sockets and nostrils, forming geometric patterns in the air that held their shape like frozen smoke. Thomas photographed everything, his camera's flash revealing details better left unseen. The corpse's fingers had elongated into roots, penetrating deep into the soil. When he traced them with ground-penetrating radar on his phone, a geology app he'd downloaded for fun, they extended down nearly 20 meters. David Kemp, Rebecca said quietly. Fish and Wildlife, 7 years service, had a daughter in Tacoma. Thomas checked his phone. No David Kemp in any federal database. They found the second body, Casey Flores, according to Rebecca, 50 meters away. This one was worse. The entire torso had opened like a flower, ribs splayed outward in perfect symmetry. Inside, instead of organs, grew what appeared to be a miniature forest. Tiny trees, perfect in detail, no more than 6 inches tall but showing growth rings indicating hundreds of years of age. Thomas took tissue samples, careful not to make direct contact. Under his field microscope, the cells showed normal human DNA structure, but with chloroplasts integrated into the mitochondria. Plant-animal hybrid cells that couldn't exist, but were clearly photosynthesizing. They were trying to leave, Rebecca said. The forest wouldn't let them. It needed them for something. Needed us. Rebecca, what happened here? Exactly. She sat on a log, one of the few that looked normal. We came to check on the spotted owls, routine survey, but the trees, they were growing as we watched. Not fast enough to see directly, but fast enough that the trail disappeared behind us within hours. We tried to cut our way out. She gestured to the chainsaw. The trees grew back faster than we could cut, and the sounds they made when cut like screaming, but at a frequency that made your teeth ache. David said it was just the wood splintering. Then the spores started. Spores? From the fungi. Clouds of them, but wrong. They glowed, bioluminescent. When David breathed them in, he said he could feel them in his lungs growing. Casey tried to help him, but the spores were already in her too. I had my respirator on. Protocol for potential histoplasmosis zones. Thomas checked his own P100 filter, still sealed properly. How long before they... 3 hours for David, maybe 4 for Casey. But they didn't die, not exactly. They just became part of it. I could hear them talking even after their mouths had filled with mycelia. They kept saying the forest needed to spread, needed to grow, that it had been waiting so long, trapped in one dimension, and now it had found a way through. Thomas's rational mind rejected this. Mass hysteria, ergot poisoning from contaminated supplies, some unknown pathogen causing hallucinations. But the bodies were real. The impossible growth was real. He took air samples, soil samples, water from a nearby stream that ran slightly uphill. Another impossibility his eyes insisted was true. The water, when tested with his portable kit, showed normal pH, normal dissolved minerals, but under microscopic examination, contained structures that resembled no known microorganism. They had characteristics of both diatoms and neurons, forming networks in the water that pulsed with electrical activity. We need to report this, Thomas said. CDC, EPA, hell, maybe even USAMRIID. Rebecca laughed, bitter and knowing. I tried. The radio worked, but no one could hear me. Or rather, they heard someone else. Someone with my voice saying everything was fine, survey complete, returning to base. I listened to myself give false reports for 3 days. Thomas tried his radio. Static at first, then his own voice, though he wasn't speaking. Anderson here. Everything normal at the Bogachil site. No anomalies detected. He turned the radio off, cold sweat running down his back despite the morning chill. We should leave, he said. Yes, Rebecca agreed. But look behind us. Thomas turned. The trail they'd followed was gone. In its place stood trees that his instruments insisted were over 200 years old, though he'd walked through empty space minutes before. His GPS showed they'd moved 300 meters without taking a step. The forest was reorganizing itself around them. June 18, 2019 to 14:30. Hours. They'd been walking in circles for hours, though Thomas's GPS showed straight lines. Every time they tried to leave the affected zone, they found themselves back at the center. The bodies of David and Casey had changed further, more plant than human now, but somehow still breathing. Chests rising and falling with photosynthetic respiration. Thomas had filled 3 field notebooks with observations. The biological impossibilities were consistent, measurable, repeatable. Whatever was happening here followed rules, just not rules that existed in standard physics or biology textbooks. His satellite phone, which should have worked regardless of cell towers, connected only to itself, creating recursive loops of his own voice reading back his notes in languages he didn't speak. Rebecca had stopped talking an hour ago. When Thomas looked at her closely, he saw why. Thin, white filaments grew from the corners of her mouth, delicate as spider silk. She was still conscious, still walking, but something was growing inside her, using her as a substrate. The spores were everywhere now, visible in the slanted afternoon light. Thomas's respirator filtered them out, but for how long? The seal integrity light still showed green, but he'd been wearing it for 8 hours straight. Filters didn't last forever. He made a decision. Taking out his knife, he carved a message into his own arm. Not deep, just enough to scar. Quarantine Bogachil sector. Do not send rescue. T. Anderson. The pain was clarifying. It reminded him he was still human, still thinking clearly, or clearly enough. That's when he saw them. Other figures moving through the trees. They walked upright, human in shape but wrong in proportion. Too tall, joints bending in too many places. As they came closer, Thomas recognized faces. Hikers reported missing over the past decade. The Marchetti couple from 2009. College student Brendan Park from 2013. All walking, all alive by some definition, all changed. They moved with purpose, tending to the impossible trees, their fingers extending into branch-like appendages that pruned and shaped the growth. Gardener creatures maintaining a garden that shouldn't exist. Rebecca made a sound. Not quite speech, not quite song. The others responded in harmony, a chorus at the edge of human hearing. Thomas realized with cold certainty that this was communication, that they were discussing him. He ran. Not away. There was no away anymore, but toward what his GPS claimed was the park boundary. His boots crushed undergrowth that regrew instantly behind him. Branches reached for him with deliberate intent, not malicious but insistent, like a parent reaching for a child. The chainsaw was too heavy, abandoned hours ago, but he had his Leatherman multi-tool and he used it, cutting through vines that bled red sap with the iron smell of blood. Each cut seemed to anger the forest, making it grow faster, more aggressively. Then, impossibly, he was out. He stood on the normal side of the trail, the Bogachiel River trailhead sign in front of him. His GPS showed he'd traveled 0 meters from his starting point 8 hours earlier. The sun was still rising in the east, though his watch insisted it was late afternoon. Looking back, he saw only normal forest. Rebecca stood beside him, clear-eyed. Normal. No sign of fungal infiltration. "Did you get the samples you needed?" she asked pleasantly. Thomas checked his pack. Empty specimen containers. Clean notebooks. No photographs on his camera's memory card except standard trail documentation from this morning. But his arm still bore the carved message, already scabbing over. Quarantine Bogachil sector. Do not send rescue. T. Anderson. I need to report to Davidson, Thomas said carefully. Rebecca smiled. It was almost perfect, except her teeth were too white, and when she breathed out, Thomas could swear he saw spores dancing in the exhaled air. Of course. I'll file my report too. Spotted owl population stable. No anomalies detected. June 20th, 2019, Olympic National Park headquarters. Thomas sat in Davidson's office, watching the chief ranger review his report. 3 pages of carefully worded concerns about accelerated growth patterns, recommendation for further study, request for CDC consultation. Nothing about walking corpses or dimensional irregularities or forests that reorganized space-time. This fungal growth rate you're documenting, Davidson said. You're certain about the measurements? Triple-checked. Something's accelerating biological processes in that sector. Could be worth bringing in a specialized team. Davidson nodded slowly. I'll run it up the chain. Meanwhile, that area's been showing unstable geology on the surveys. We're closing it to public access for safety. Good idea, Thomas agreed. After the meeting, he checked the personnel database again. Rebecca Turner was listed as a Fish and Wildlife Ranger, 5 years service, exemplary record. David Kemp and Casey Flores existed now too, both on administrative leave for medical reasons. His carved message had healed into a scar that looked years old. When he looked at it in mirrors, it appeared backward. When he looked at it directly, it was forward. Both simultaneously true. That night, he found something in his jacket pocket, a small vial he didn't remember collecting. Inside, suspended in what looked like water but had the viscosity of mercury, was a single spore. It glowed faintly, pulsing with bioluminescent rhythm that matched his heartbeat. He should have destroyed it, should have autoclaved it, burned it, reported it to every acronym agency in the government. Instead, he placed it in his home laboratory's secured containment unit, telling himself he needed to study it, understand it. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. Part of him wanted to see it grow. July 15th, 2019. Personal Laboratory, Port Angeles. The spore had developed into something unprecedented, not quite fungus, not quite plant, certainly not animal, but exhibiting characteristics of all three. Under controlled conditions, sterile medium, regulated temperature, measured light, it grew at exactly 1 millimeter per day. Normal, safe. But when Thomas introduced variables, played music, spoke to it, even thought at it with focused intention, the growth accelerated. It responded to consciousness itself, somehow detecting and feeding on awareness. His notes filled 17 notebooks now, each one more rambling than the last. He'd documented cellular structures that contained more organelles than should fit in three-dimensional space, chemical processes that produced energy from nothing, violating thermodynamics, DNA that rewrote itself while he watched, adding base pairs that didn't exist in terrestrial biology. The scar on his arm had changed. The letters remained, but underneath his skin showed faint branching patterns like subcutaneous lightning. They didn't hurt. If anything, that part of his arm felt stronger, more alive. Rebecca called occasionally. Her voice sounded normal over the phone, but in person, Thomas could see the changes. Her pupils had developed a second iris, barely visible, that moved independently. Her hair grew in patterns that followed mathematical sequences, Fibonacci spirals, golden ratios. She'd started wearing gloves to hide the bark-like texture spreading across her palms. "It's not killing us," she said during her last visit. "It's upgrading us, making us compatible with something larger." Compatible with what? The forest that exists in more than 3 dimensions, the one that's been trying to break through for millennia. We're the bridge, the translation medium between 2 incompatible forms of life. Thomas wanted to argue, but the evidence was undeniable. His blood samples showed normal human cells alongside impossible hybrids. His lung capacity had increased 30%. He could photosynthesize, actually generate energy from sunlight. Not much, but measurable. The CDC had come and gone, finding nothing unusual in the Bogachil sector. Their instruments couldn't detect what was there. Or perhaps the forest didn't want to be detected by those who wouldn't understand, wouldn't appreciate its gift, because that's what Rebecca insisted it was. A gift. Evolution accelerated, humanity's next phase, if they chose to accept it. August 3rd, 2019. The containment unit failed at 3:17 a.m. Thomas woke to find his laboratory transformed, every surface covered in growth that shouldn't exist. Crystalline structures that were simultaneously organic and mineral, producing their own light in wavelengths human eyes shouldn't perceive but somehow did. The original spore had become a colony, then a network, then something beyond classification. It communicated through chemical signals that Thomas's enhanced nervous system could interpret as language. Not words, but concepts, images, entire libraries of information compressed into molecular exchanges. It showed him the truth. The forest in the Bogachil sector wasn't invading. It had always been here, existing parallel to normal space, occasionally bleeding through in places where reality wore thin. The Olympic Peninsula, with its unique geology and electromagnetic properties, had dozens of such thin spots. The spores weren't infectious agents but translators. rewriting DNA to allow organisms to exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. David and Casey weren't dead but transformed. Their consciousness expanded beyond individual identity into something collective and vast. Thomas understood he had a choice. He could still fight this, could call in authorities who might believe him now that he had proof growing in his lab. They'd burn it all, establish a real quarantine, maybe nuke the site if necessary. Or he could join Rebecca in helping it spread. Controlled, careful, voluntary. Let humanity evolve into something that could survive what was coming. Because the spores showed him that too. Climate change, ecosystem collapse, the slow death of a planet pushed beyond its limits. The transformed forest could survive all of that, could thrive in conditions that would kill normal life. His phone rang. Davidson. Tom, we've got a situation. 3 hikers went missing near Bogachil despite the closure. Search and rescue found them this morning. They're changed, like Rebecca was, but worse. We need you here. Thomas looked at his arm. The branching patterns had spread to his shoulder, beautiful in their fractal complexity. He could feel photosynthesis occurring in his skin cells, converting morning sunlight to energy. I'll be right there, he said. He gathered his equipment, including vials of spores he'd cultivated, modified versions that grew slower, gave the host more time to adapt. Perhaps there was a middle path, a way to control this transformation, to guide it rather than let it run wild. But as he drove toward the park, he noticed the trees along Highway 101 were different. Subtle changes. Leaves oriented at impossible angles, bark patterns that hurt to analyze too closely. The forest was already spreading, with or without his help. His GPS glitched, showing his position in multiple locations simultaneously. All of them were true. August 4th, 2019. Final report: Thomas stood at the edge of the Bogachil sector with Davidson and a CDC emergency response team. The 3 rescued hikers were in quarantine tents, their bodies showing advanced transformation. One had roots instead of feet. Another's skin had become photosynthetic, green with chlorophyll. The third no longer had discrete organs, but rather a colony organism wearing a human shape. All 3 were conscious, claimed to feel better than ever, spoke of unity with something vast and benevolent. We can't let this spread, Davidson said. Thomas nodded, even as the spores in his pocket pulsed with eager life. We need to establish a perimeter, full hazmat protocols. No one goes in without protective equipment. It was a lie, of course. The protection didn't matter. The forest had already chosen who would transform and who would remain unchanged. Thomas could see it in the patterns. Davidson would never be affected, his biology somehow incompatible. But the young CDC technician, the one taking soil samples, already had spores germinating in her lungs. She'd be like Rebecca within a week. What is this thing? Davidson asked. Thomas considered his answer carefully. A xenobiological incursion, he said, using terminology that would trigger the right protocols, ensure the area stayed quarantined, something that transforms terrestrial biology into something else. Can we stop it? We can slow it, maybe contain it to this sector. But Davidson... Thomas met his eyes. What if we're not supposed to stop it? What if this is evolution, trying to save us from ourselves? Davidson's expression hardened. Evolution doesn't need our permission. No, Thomas agreed. It doesn't. That night, alone in his laboratory, Thomas made his choice. He removed his respirator, opened the containment unit, and inhaled deeply. The spores tasted like earth and stars, like the first breath of a newborn, and the last gasp of a dying world. The transformation began immediately. Not painful, but overwhelming, every cell in his body singing with new purpose. He could feel the network. Rebecca, David, Casey, the 3 hikers, dozens of others who'd been quietly changed, all connected. All part of something that existed beyond human comprehension but included humanity within it. His last fully human thought was a question. Had the forest been waiting for them? Or had they been waiting for the forest? The answer came not in words but in the rustle of leaves that had never known wind, in the growth of roots that penetrated not soil but space itself, in the slow breath of a planet learning to speak. Thomas Anderson ceased to exist as a discrete individual at 11:47 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. What remained looked like him, spoke like him, continued his work with even greater dedication. But when you looked closely at his eyes, if you knew how to look, you could see forests growing in dimensions that hadn't existed yesterday. The reports he filed were meticulous, thorough, and completely true. They just described a truth that most humans couldn't perceive yet. The Bogachiel sector remained quarantined, officially due to unstable geology and unusual fungal populations. Unofficially, it became a place of pilgrimage for those who felt the call, who dreamed of forests that grew in impossible directions, who woke with dirt under their fingernails and chlorophyll in their bloodstream. The transformation spread slowly, carefully, voluntarily. By the time anyone noticed, it would be too late to stop. Or perhaps too late to refuse the gift. Rebecca Turner was never seen again in her original form. But sometimes hikers in the Olympic National Park report encountering a ranger who knows trails that aren't on any map, who can show them trees older than the planet, who speaks of a forest that exists in more places than one. They say if you follow her deep enough into the green, you can hear the earth itself breathing. They say if you listen closely enough, you can hear it calling your name. Hope this disturbed you deeply. What's your theory about what really happened to Rebecca Turner? Natural or something else? The 17 elk stood motionless in a perfect circle at 9,147 feet elevation on the northeastern slope of Mount Washburn, their breath forming small clouds in the October morning air. James Mitchell lowered his Zeiss Victory RF binoculars and checked his Garmin GPS map 64SX again. The coordinates hadn't changed. 44.7976 degrees N, 110.4334 degrees W. Neither had the elk's position in the last 4 hours. Base, this is Mitchell at Washburn Observation Point 3, he said into his Motorola APX 8000. The radio crackled with static that shouldn't exist this close to Canyon Village. I need a wildlife behavior consult. 17 elk exhibiting unusual congregation patterns. Copy that, Mitchell. Define unusual. The voice of dispatch sounded oddly distant despite the signal strength indicator showing full bars. James pulled out his field notebook, the same Write in the Rain model he'd used since getting his PhD in wildlife biology 8 years ago. Before the Park Service, before the pattern started. 17 individuals maintaining perfect circular formation. No feeding, no social interaction. They've been stationary for, he checked his Casio ProTrek watch, 4 hours, 13 minutes. Weather coming in from the northwest. Might want to wrap up your count. James glanced at the cloudless sky, then at his weather radio. The NOAA broadcast showed high pressure dominating the entire region through next Tuesday. Negative on that weather dispatch. I'm showing clear conditions. The radio went silent. Not dead, he could hear the carrier wave, but silent in that particular way that had become familiar over the last 3 weeks, since Rebecca Stone and the other 4. Through the binoculars, he watched one elk's ear twitch. The movement traveled clockwise through the circle, each animal's ear moving in sequence like a wave at a stadium. Caribou did this in the Arctic sometimes, he'd read, but elk? Never, and certainly not with this mechanical precision. He pulled out his Canon EOS 5D Mark IV and began documenting, frame after frame of impossibility. The elk's eyes were wrong too, not the horizontal pupils he'd studied for years, but something else. The photos would show it. They had to. At 11:47 a.m., according to his watch, though his phone showed 11:51 and his GPS displayed 11:44, the elk moved. All 17 heads turned southwest in perfect synchronization toward the Hayden Valley. Then they walked, not ran, not trotted, walked, in single file, maintaining exactly 3 meters between each animal. James followed at a distance, his training in wildlife tracking automatic even as his scientific mind struggled with what he was observing. Elk didn't migrate in October. They certainly didn't migrate southwest when their winter range was north. And they absolutely didn't maintain perfect geometric spacing while doing it. The radio crackled. "Mitchell, we need you back at Canyon. We've got another one." "Another what?" "Hiker reported missing. Rebecca Stone's hiking partner. Guy named Clayton Wells. Last seen yesterday morning heading to, get this, Mount Washburn." James stopped. The elk continued their impossible march, disappearing into the lodgepole pines. Yesterday morning. But Clayton had helped with the search for Rebecca just 2 days ago. James had spoken to him personally, taken his statement about their planned route through the Specimen Ridge Trail. Dispatch, confirmed timeline. Clayton Wells participated in search operations on October 15th. Negative. No record of Clayton Wells in any SAR operations. According to his wife, he went hiking with Rebecca Stone on October 12th. She returned alone, said he wanted to stay another night. James felt the elevation, though he'd been acclimated for months. His pulse oximeter read 97%, perfect for this altitude. But his hands shook as he pulled out the search roster from his pack. There it was, clear as day. Clayton Wells, volunteer searcher, October 15th, 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. The ink looked fresh, too fresh for a 3-day-old signature. By the time he reached the Canyon Village Ranger Station, the elk migration had covered 12 miles in a straight line that crossed streams, roads, and valleys with no deviation. He'd tracked them on GPS until they vanished into a thermal area where no ungulate should willingly go. The sulfur dioxide levels alone should have driven them away. Instead, they'd walked directly toward the highest concentrations. Inside the station, Chief Ranger Patricia Reeves had spread out the kind of map array that meant serious trouble. USGS topographical maps, aerial photos from the last week, and a laptop showing GIS data layers that made James's stomach tighten. 17, Reeves said without preamble. 17 what? Hikers, missing, over the last 5 years, all from the same trail systems, all during October. She pointed to red pins on the map. But here's where it gets interesting. James studied the pattern. The pins formed a rough spiral centered on the Specimen Ridge area, each point precisely 1.7 miles from the next. That's mathematically impossible. Random disappearances don't form geometric patterns. No, Reeves agreed. They don't, and look at this. She pulled up a spreadsheet. Recovery rate for missing hikers in Yellowstone averages 94% within 72 hours. These 17? 0 recoveries. No bodies, no gear, no trace, like they just stopped existing. What about search dogs? Dogs refuse to track past certain points, different points for each case, but she overlaid another map. Those refusal points form their own pattern. A larger spiral, same center. James felt the familiar weight of scientific skepticism. Geological anomaly, magnetic field variations can affect animal behavior. My first thought, too. Reeves pulled up seismic data. Had the geology team run every test they could think of. Nothing. Background radiation normal, magnetics within standard parameters, no unusual seismic activity. She paused. But they did find this. She handed him a photograph from a trail camera near Specimen Creek. The timestamp read October 12th, 11:43 a.m., the exact time Rebecca Stone was reported missing. The image showed her clearly, her red North Face jacket distinctive against the forest backdrop. But behind her, barely visible in the trees, were shapes. Tall, bipedal shapes that stood wrong, joints bending in ways that made James's eyes water to follow. Digital artifact? He asked, though he could see the authentic Reckonix watermark. That's what we thought. But look at her shadow. James looked closer. Rebecca's shadow fell northeast, consistent with the sun angle for that time and date. But she cast 2 shadows. The second fell northwest, as if lit by a different sun. I need to see the site, James said. Reeves nodded. Figured you would. But Mitchell... She pulled out a Pelican case and opened it. Inside were 6 GPS units, all different brands. Every screen showed different coordinates despite sitting side by side. The variance was subtle, seconds of arc, but enough to put you a quarter mile off target in rough terrain. Started 3 weeks ago, she said. Same time as the migrations, James finished. I've been documenting unusual animal movements. Elk, but also bears, wolves, even birds. All moving in patterns that violate everything we know about their behavior. Reeves pulled out a file marked with biohazard tape. There's more. Rebecca Stone? She was found this morning. James's head snapped up. Found? Where? That's the problem. She was found at the Norris Geyser Basin Visitor Center. Walked in at 6 a.m., asked for coffee, said she'd been hiking since yesterday. But she's been missing for 5 days, yes, and Mitchell... Reeves's voice dropped. She hasn't aged 5 days. Her hair, fingernails, even the food in her stomach according to the medical exam. It's all consistent with maybe 6 hours since her last meal. The sandwich her husband confirmed she packed for lunch on October 12th. Where is she now? Livingston Hospital. Physically fine, but she has no memory of the missing time. Last thing she remembers is taking photos at Specimen Creek, then walking into the visitor center. The 5 days between? Nothing. James gathered his equipment. The hike to Specimen Creek would take 4 hours at a steady pace. It was already 2 p.m. He'd be hiking out in the dark, but the moon was nearly full. Take backup, Reeves said. Who? Everyone's either on search teams or missing. I know. She handed him a satellite phone. Check in every hour. If you miss a check-in, we're sending everything we've got. The trail to Specimen Creek started normal enough. James noted the expected species. Clark's nutcracker, mountain chickadees, a few late-season butterflies. But 3 miles in, things shifted. The birds flew in straight lines, no longer following the chaotic patterns of natural flight. A group of butterflies, painted ladies that should have migrated weeks ago, hung in the air in a perfect grid pattern, wings beating in synchronization. He documented everything, his scientific training overriding the crawling sensation at the base of his skull. The temperature readings were wrong too. His thermometer showed 47 degrees, but his breath didn't fog. The air had that thin quality of high altitude, but his GPS showed only 7,200 feet, lower than the trailhead. At 4:17 p.m. or 4:23 or 4:14, depending on which device he checked, he reached the spot where Rebecca had vanished. The trail camera was still there, solar panel intact. He downloaded the memory card to his tablet, scrolling through thousands of images. Normal, normal, normal. Then, October 12th, 11:43 a.m. But this image was different from what Reeves had shown him. Rebecca was there, yes, but she wasn't alone. Clayton Wells stood beside her, both of them looking directly at the camera. The timestamp was identical to the other photo. Same moment. 2 different realities. He scrolled forward. 11:44 a.m. The forest, empty. 11:45 a.m. Rebecca again, but older. Gray streaking her hair. Lines on her face that hadn't been there in any missing person photo. 11:46 a.m. Clayton Wells alone. His clothes rotted as if he'd been in the elements for months. 11:47 a.m. 17 elk in a perfect circle, their eyes reflecting the camera flash in patterns that looked almost like writing. The satellite phone buzzed. Check-in time. But when he answered, the voice wasn't dispatch. James. Rebecca Stone's voice, crystal clear despite being in a hospital 100 miles away. Don't trust the shadows. They're not shadows. The line went dead. When he tried to call back, dispatch answered normally, confirming his position and status. They had no record of any call from Rebecca Stone. The sun was setting now, painting the forest in shades that didn't match the time of day. Too red for 6 p.m., too bright for the approaching darkness his watch insisted was coming. He continued toward Specimen Creek, following protocol even as protocol lost meaning. The creek itself ran backward. James knelt at the bank, watching water flow uphill in defiance of gravity. He dropped a leaf into the stream and watched it move against the current, accelerating as it climbed. His Brunton compass spun lazily, unable to find north. The temperature had dropped to 23 degrees above according to his thermometer, but the creek hadn't frozen. Movement in his peripheral vision. The elk were back, but now there were more. Hundreds, all walking in that same single file, that same perfect spacing. But mixed among them were other things. Shapes that might have been human if humans had learned to walk on joints that bent wrong. If human necks could turn 180 degrees while the body faced forward. He raised his camera, but the autofocus wouldn't lock. Manual focus showed only blur, as if the subjects existed at multiple distances simultaneously. The FLIR thermal scope he'd brought for night navigation showed the elk as cold spots, colder than the ambient air, colder than anything living should be. A branch snapped behind him. He turned to find Clayton Wells standing 20 feet away, looking exactly as he had during the search 2 days ago. Fresh clothes, recent haircut, the same Timex expedition watch James had noticed during their interview. "You should leave," Clayton said. His breath didn't fog despite the freezing temperature. "The migration isn't finished." "Clayton, where have you been?" "Your wife." "My wife thinks I'm missing." Clayton stepped closer, and James noticed his footprints in the frost were wrong. They aged as he watched. Fresh prints becoming days old in seconds, moss growing in the impressions, tiny insects colonizing the disturbed soil. "I am missing. Have been for 5 years now. October 12th, 2019. Check your records." James's tablet still showed the search roster. Clayton Wells, October 15th, 2024. But as he watched, the ink faded, the name dissolving like it was being erased from time itself. "The elk know the way," Clayton continued. "They've always known. Long before the park, before the surveys, before humans decided to put lines on maps. There are places where the lines don't work, where time runs like that creek, uphill and backwards, and sometimes not at all. This is impossible. You're suffering from exposure, hypothermia maybe." Clayton laughed, a sound that came from too many throats. "Take Rebecca's advice. Don't trust the shadows, especially your own." James looked down. In the moonlight, when had the moon risen? He cast 3 shadows. One fell where it should. The second stretched impossibly long, reaching back toward the trail. The third fell upward, darkening the stars above his head. His satellite phone buzzed. 7 missed check-ins. Impossible. He'd been here maybe 30 minutes. The screen showed 2:47 a.m. October 18th, 3 days after he'd left the station. "The migration completes tomorrow," Clayton said, already fading like his name on the roster. "Everyone who's lost finds their way. Everyone who's found loses theirs. The park makes its choice." The elk were surrounding him now, their impossible eyes reflecting moonlight that came from no moon in the sky. They walked in their perfect line, and James understood with the clarity of fever dreams that they weren't migrating to anywhere. They were migrating from wherever things went when they stopped existing in the world humans had mapped. He ran. His GPS showed him moving at 3 Kampa, 15 map, somehow 5 maf. The temperature read absolute 0, then 451 degree, then numbers that included letters. His watch ran backward until it showed dates from before he was born. Behind him, hundreds of footsteps maintained that perfect spacing, that mechanical rhythm. But when he turned, nothing was there except his own shadows. 5 of them now, each running in different directions. He burst from the forest at dawn. His instruments claimed it was simultaneously October 15th, 18th, and 23rd, to find the ranger station surrounded by search and rescue vehicles. Reeves ran toward him, her face showing relief and confusion in equal measure. "Mitchell, where the hell have you been? You left 6 hours ago." 6 hours. He checked his GPS track. It showed a simple out and back to Specimen Creek. Total time 5 hours, 58 minutes. The timestamp photos on his camera showed the same. But his beard had 3 days of growth, and his pack contained food he didn't remember eating, water bottles he didn't remember emptying. "We found Clayton Wells," Reeves said carefully. "He was at the Norris Visitor Center, just like Rebecca. Says he's been hiking since yesterday morning." James pulled up the photos on his camera. Every image was normal. Deer, birds, standard forest shots. No synchronized butterflies, no impossible elk formations. No pictures of people who were missing or not missing or both. Except one. The last photo, taken at 2:47 a.m. according to the XIF data, showed the 17 elk in their perfect circle. But in the center, where nothing had been before, stood 17 people. Rebecca Stone, Clayton Wells, 15 others whose faces matched the missing person files. They were all looking at the camera, all smiling, all casting shadows that fell in 17 different directions, toward places that didn't exist on any map. "Mitchell," Reeves said quietly, "your shadow." He looked down. In the morning sun, James Mitchell cast two shadows. One fell west, as it should at dawn. The other fell east, toward the rising sun, as if lit by something behind him that had followed him out of the forest. He checked his pulse, steady at 72 BPM, oxygen saturation 98%, core temperature 98.6 degrees, every biological marker normal, except his cells were aging backward. He could feel it, a subtle wrongness in his bones, his blood moving in directions that violated basic anatomy. When he blinked, he sometimes saw through eyes that weren't in his head. "I need to file my report," he said, his voice steady despite the creeping certainty that he wasn't entirely James Mitchell anymore. That part of him was still out there, walking in perfect formation with 17 elk toward a migration that never ended. Reeves nodded slowly. "Rebecca and Clayton don't remember anything. Brain scans show normal activity, but..." She hesitated. "Their mitochondria are different. Still functional, still producing ATP, but the electron transport chain is running in partial reverse. Biologically impossible, but there it is." James thought about the creek flowing uphill, about shadows that fell toward light sources, about time that moved in directions humans hadn't named. Maybe impossible is just another word for haven't mapped it yet. That night, he wrote his report. 17 pages for 17 missing hikers. He included all the scientific data, all the measurements and observations, but he couldn't explain the pull he felt toward Mount Washburn, the certainty that tomorrow or yesterday or a week ago, he would join the migration. The elk were out there, walking their perfect line through spaces between seconds, through forests that existed in the gaps of surveyed land. They carried something, a knowledge, a pattern, a way of being that predated human understanding of how reality should work. His second shadow grew longer each day, reaching toward horizons that maps insisted didn't exist. By October 23rd, if dates still meant anything, 3 more hikers had vanished. The pattern held, the spiral tightened, the migration continued. And James Mitchell, PhD in wildlife biology, ranger of 8 years, keeper of careful scientific records, felt his bones teaching him a new way to walk, one that would carry him to places where 17 wasn't a number but a direction, where shadows were doors, where time flowed like water, finding its level across dimensions humans had never thought to measure. The last entry in his field notebook, found weeks later in his abandoned truck at the Specimen Creek trailhead, contained only coordinates, not latitude and longitude but something else. Numbers that included colors, directions that referenced seasons, measurements in units that didn't exist. 17 of them, naturally. The elk knew the way. They'd always known. The migration never stopped. It only waited for the next person to notice their shadow falling the wrong way, to follow it home to places that weren't places, to join the perfect formation that walked between the mapped world and the truth underneath. Rebecca Stone and Clayton Wells gave identical statements to investigators. They remembered hiking. They remembered returning. The 5 days or 3 days or no days between, gone, like footprints aging backward into nothing. But sometimes, on October mornings when the frost formed patterns that looked almost like writing, they cast extra shadows. And in those shadows, 17 elk walked in perfect formation, carrying 17 people toward a horizon that existed only when no one was measuring it. Hope this disturbed you deeply. What's your theory about what really happened to James? Natural phenomenon or something else? The Garmin GPS map 64st in Derek Morrison's hand showed coordinates that shouldn't exist. Not according to the official Olympic National Park trail database he'd memorized over 15 years of service. Yet here was Ashley Turner's last known position, logged by her emergency beacon 3 days ago, pointing to a section of the Hoh rainforest that appeared on no modern map. Derek compared the GPS reading to the yellowed document spread across his station desk. The paper felt wrong beneath his fingers. Too smooth, too warm, like skin that had been underwater too long. Someone had slipped it under his door that morning with a note. She found this before she left. Thought you should know. B.H. Bill Hendricks. The old maintenance supervisor who'd worked the park since the 70s and never said more than 5 words at a time. The fact he'd written anything at all made Derek's jaw clench. The map showed Olympic's trail system, but wrong. Paths that had been closed since the 1960s were marked as primary routes. Modern trails didn't exist, and scattered across the yellowed surface were dark brown stains, each accompanied by a date and initials written in cramped handwriting. The marks clustered in specific locations, 7 of them forming a rough pattern Derek couldn't quite identify. TK, August 12, 1963, the hunger came here. ML, October 3, 1971, 8 bark, then worse. RP, December 24, 1985, Christmas feast of flesh. Derek's coffee had gone cold 2 hours ago. He pushed it aside and pulled up the park's missing persons database on his laptop. Cross-referencing the initials and dates took less time than he'd hoped. Every marking corresponded to a ranger who'd vanished without a trace. Not hikers or tourists, exclusively National Park Service personnel. Thomas Kellerman, 1963. Marvin Lancaster, 1971. Rebecca Price, 1985. All experienced. All declared lost after extensive search operations. All last seen heading into the backcountry alone on what should have been routine patrols. The freshest stain was still tacky to the touch, though Derek couldn't understand how. The initials next to it made his throat constrict. AT, November 15th, 2015, still hungry. Today was November 18th. Derek keyed his Motorola XPR 755E. Dispatch, this is Morrison. I'm heading out to investigate Turner's last coordinates. Solo patrol, grid reference. Negative, Morrison. Chief Ranger Patricia Wolf's voice crackled through immediately, as if she'd been waiting by the radio. Weather Service just issued a severe storm warning. All backcountry operations suspended for the next 48 hours. Derek looked outside. The morning sky was crystalline, not a cloud visible through the station windows. The barometric pressure reading on his weather station showed 30.42 inches, high and stable. Chief, I'm looking at clear conditions here. Weather Service must be... I said negative, Morrison, that's final. And Derek, stay away from the old growth sections today. The radio went dead. Derek tried calling back, but got only static. He switched channels, tried other rangers' direct frequencies. Nothing but white noise, though the radio's display showed full signal strength. He folded the map carefully, noting how it seemed to resist being creased, as if the paper wanted to remain flat, exposed, readable. His bench-made bushcrafter knife went into its sheath, bear spray clipped to his belt. He loaded his pack with standard SAR gear, first aid kit, emergency blanket, water purification tablets, MREs for 3 days. The protocol manual explicitly stated no solo searches, but Ashley had been out there for 72 hours. The critical survival window was closing. The drive to the Hoh River trailhead took 40 minutes. Derek passed 3 other ranger vehicles heading the opposite direction, back toward the main station. None of them responded to his radio calls or acknowledged his waves. Their faces looked wrong through the windshields, blank, unfocused, like they were sleeping with their eyes open. At the trailhead, Derek found Ashley's Tacoma parked at an odd angle, driver's door hanging open. The interior was pristine except for claw marks on the steering wheel. Not from an animal. The gouges matched human fingernails torn down to bleeding quick, judging by the dark stains in the vinyl. Derek photographed everything, uploading the images to the park's server through his phone. The upload failed. No signal, though he was barely 4 miles from a cell tower. He tried the satellite messenger on his belt. Device error, unable to acquire satellites. Even the GPS struggled. Coordinates jumping randomly before stabilizing on Ashley's last position. 47 toward 8606 degree N, 123.981 degree W. According to the modern maps, those coordinates placed her in the middle of the Ho River. According to the old map, they marked one of the stained locations dated September 9, 1978. The initials beside it read, JM, tried to eat my own. The rest was obscured by what looked like teeth marks in the paper itself. Derek shouldered his pack and started hiking. The trail felt wrong immediately. The usual sounds of the rainforest, Roosevelt elk browsing, Douglas squirrels chattering, varied thrushes calling, were absent. Not quiet, but absent, as if the forest was holding its breath. The air tasted metallic, like copper pennies left in water. 2 miles in, the maintained trail ended at a massive nurse log that Derek had passed hundreds of times. But today, barely visible beneath the moss, he could see the continuation of an older path. The wood underfoot was different. Cedar puncheon walkway, the kind the Park Service hadn't used since the 1970s. It should have rotted away decades ago, but the planks looked freshly cut, sap still beating on the surface. The old map guided him through stands of Sitka spruce and western hemlock that grew at impossible angles, their trunks twisted into spirals that hurt to follow with his eyes. Club moss hung in curtains so thick they blocked out the sun, creating a twilight world at 2 in the afternoon. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of 3 steps. Derek found Ashley's first marker after 3 hours, her ranger hat, placed deliberately on a branch at eye level. No damage, no blood, positioned like a trail sign. 50 yards further, her utility belt, tools still attached, hung from another branch. Each piece of equipment had been removed with care, not torn off in panic or struggle. The GPS showed he was nearing the coordinates. The forest opened into a small clearing where no clearing should exist. In the center grew a single big-leaf maple, its trunk easily 15 feet in diameter, impossibly large for the species. The bark was covered in carved symbols Derek didn't recognize, though they made his eyes water to look at directly. Ashley's uniform lay folded neatly at the base of the tree. Her boots sat on top, laces tied. Her name tag was missing, the threads torn as if she'd ripped it off herself. Dark stains on the collar weren't blood. Derek could smell the digestive acid from where he stood. Ashley? His voice came out as barely a whisper. The forest swallowed the sound immediately. No echo, no resonance, as if the air was too thick to carry sound waves properly. Movement in his peripheral vision. Derek spun, hand on his bear spray, but saw only trees. No, the trees themselves were wrong. They were closer than they'd been moments ago. The clearing was shrinking, the forest pressing inward like a closing fist. The old map in his pocket grew hot enough to burn through the fabric. Derek pulled it out and new text was appearing on its surface, wet and red like fresh ink. DM, November 18th, 2015. The hunger recognizes you. His stomach cramped violently, not pain but emptiness, a hollow sensation that started in his gut and spread outward. Derek had eaten breakfast just 4 hours ago, but his body screamed that he was starving, had been starving for days, weeks, always had been starving and just never noticed until now. The rational part of his mind, the part trained by 15 years of backcountry experience, recognized the signs. Acute onset hypoglycemia, possibly triggered by spores or some environmental toxin. He needed glucose, needed to eat something immediately. Derek fumbled for an energy bar in his pack. The wrapper tasted better than the bar itself. He found himself gnawing on the plastic, teeth scraping against the metallic inner lining. The sound that came from his throat wasn't quite human, too low, too resonant, like an elk's bugle filtered through human vocal cords. Derek spat out the wrapper, horrified. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from hunger so intense it felt like his cells were devouring themselves. He bit into the energy bar, but the processed oats and honey tasted like ash. His body wanted something else, something warm and rich, and a crack of branches behind him. Derek turned to see Ashley Turner standing at the edge of the clearing, naked except for mud, and what might have been dried blood painting her skin in patterns that matched the tree carvings. Her ranger's badge was pressed into the flesh of her sternum, the metal partially absorbed into her skin like she was growing around it. Her mouth opened and Derek expected words, a cry for help, something human. Instead, she made the same deep, resonant sound he'd just produced. Her teeth were wrong, too many of them, filed to points. Gums receded to show roots that went too deep into her jaw. "The map chooses," Ashley said, though her lips didn't match the words. The sound seemed to come from the air around her, the trees themselves speaking through her presence. "It's always been choosing, since the first ranger walked these paths. The forest needs guardians who understand the real hunger." Derek's hand found his radio, muscle memory overriding the spreading numbness in his fingers. "Dispatch, emergency, officer needs..." The radio crumbled in his grip like old bread. Inside, instead of circuits and batteries, was a mass of fungal growth, white mycelia threading through what should have been electronics. Spores puffed out in a cloud that Derek couldn't help but inhale. The world shifted. Colors became flavors. Sounds became textures. The forest wasn't made of trees anymore, but of food. Endless food. If only he could recognize what was meant to be eaten. The bark looked like dried meat. The moss resembled fat deposits. And Ashley looked like a feast. The Macaw people knew. She continued, stepping closer. Her movements were wrong, joints bending at angles that shouldn't exist. They called this place forbidden for a reason. Not because of what lives here, but because of what it makes us become. The rangers who disappeared didn't get lost, Derek. They found their purpose. They're still here. Still watching. Still hungry. Derek's vision flickered between two realities. In one, Ashley stood before him, transformed but alive. In the other, he saw the truth. A thing wearing Ashley's skin like an ill-fitting costume, something that had been human once, but had been digested and reformed from the inside out by an intelligence older than the forest itself. The map burned in his pocket, searing through fabric and into flesh. Derek pulled it out to find new marks appearing, fresh stains spreading across the yellowed surface. But now he could see the pattern the locations formed, a massive sigil covering the entire Hoh rainforest, each disappearance a point in a geometric design that was almost complete. Almost. It needed one more point. One more ranger at specific coordinates that would complete something that had been building since the park's establishment in 1938. "You can feel it, can't you?" Ashley's voice multiplied, echoing from the trees, from the ground, from inside Derek's own skull. The real hunger, not for food, but for transformation. To become part of the forest's digestive system, to process the hikers, the tourists, the ones who don't belong. We're the enzymes, Derek. We break things down into something the forest can absorb. Derek's knees buckled. The hunger was beyond physical now, existential, spiritual, a void that demanded to be filled with something that normal food could never satisfy. He understood why Ashley had marked her trail with clothing. She'd been shedding her humanity piece by piece, leaving it behind like a snake molting skin. Through blurring vision, he saw them emerging from the trees. Dozens of figures, all naked, all painted in the same symbols, all wearing pieces of ranger uniforms grown into their flesh. He recognized faces from old staff photos, rangers who'd supposedly retired, transferred, or simply stopped showing up one day. They moved in perfect synchronization, like organs in a single body. Thomas Kellerman from 1963 was there, his skin bark rough, fingers extended into root-like appendages that disappeared into the earth. Marvin Lancaster, reported missing in 1971, had eyes that were just holes showing fungal growth behind them, bioluminescent in the gathering dark. Rebecca Price from 1985 had a mouth that opened too wide, revealing rows of teeth going down her throat like a lamprey's. They formed a circle around Derek, and he understood he wasn't being hunted. He was being welcomed. The transformation had already begun the moment he'd touched the map. Every ranger who'd disappeared had gone through this same process. The map appearing, the hunger starting, the compulsion to investigate alone, and finally, the integration into something that wore the forest like a skin but was older, hungrier, more patient than any human conception of nature. "We protect the park," they said in unison, their voices creating harmonics that made Derek's bones resonate. From the inside, from the cellular level, we are the immune system responding to infection, and humanity is the infection. Derek tried to stand, to run, but his legs weren't responding correctly anymore. Looking down, he saw his boots were sprouting mycelia, white threads penetrating the leather and spreading across the ground, connecting him to the network that pulsed beneath the forest floor. He could feel it. Every tree, every fungus, every decomposing log, all connected in a web of hunger that had been feeding for millennia. The old map fell from his nerveless fingers, and he saw the final entry appearing. DM, November 18th, 2015, digestion complete. But Derek Morrison wasn't gone. He was transforming, every cell in his body receiving new instructions, every thought being rewritten in a language of consumption and growth. The hunger wasn't something attacking him. It was something he'd always been, just dormant until the forest woke it up. Patricia Wolfe would find his abandoned vehicle in 3 days. She'd file the same report she'd filed for Ashley, for all the others. Equipment failure, probable wildlife encounter, search suspended due to weather. She knew the truth, had known it since she'd become chief ranger, and inherited the knowledge that came with the position. The park needed its guardians, and the guardians needed to eat. The clearing closed completely, trees pressing together until no trace remained of the space where Derek had stood. Somewhere in the canopy, something that had once been human and was now more and less than that began its first hunt. It could smell hikers 3 miles away, their sweat and fear and warm blood calling to it like a dinner bell. The Garmin GPS unit lay in the moss, its screen flickering between coordinates that existed and ones that didn't, marking places where reality was thin and hungry things waited. The device would be found eventually, returned to the ranger station, cleaned and reissued to the next new hire who showed promise, who had the right psychological profile, who would one day receive an old map slipped under their door. Ashley Turner watched from her new position in the canopy, her body reformed into something that could navigate both the vertical world of the trees and the horizontal world of the forest floor. She no longer remembered her human name, only her function: to process, to digest, to transform those who entered the forest into something the ancient hunger could use. The other guardians welcomed her into their network, consciousness merging with the mycelial web that connected every living thing in the rainforest. Through their collective awareness, she could feel new hikers entering the park, their footsteps sending vibrations through the soil, their breath adding carbon dioxide to the air that fed the trees that fed the hunger that was always growing. Derek Morrison's final human thought, before his consciousness dissolved into the collective, was a realization that the park's motto was more literal than anyone knew: experience your America. The America that existed before humans, that would exist after, that was currently digesting civilization one hiker, one ranger, one person at a time, using their own protectors as the enzymes to break them down. By sunset, the transformation was complete. The thing that had been Derek Morrison took its position in the network, guardian and predator, protector and processor. It could feel the next map already forming, spontaneously generating from the fungal network's need for another guardian. Someone would find it soon, probably slipped under their door with a cryptic note, and the cycle would continue. The ranger station's radio crackled to life after hours of silence. "All units, this is Chief Wolfe. Weather's cleared. Resume normal patrols tomorrow. And remember, stay together out there. The forest is particularly active this time of year." But the rangers who heard the message all understood the subtext. The forest was hungry, had always been hungry, and they were its teeth. Some of them were still human enough to feel horror at this knowledge. Others had been feeding for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to be anything other than hungry. In the Ho rainforest, something howled. Not wolf, not wind, but the sound of a human throat learning to make new sounds, practicing for the hunt. The tourists camping at the established sites would hear it and assume it was just nature, just wildlife, just the mysterious sounds of an ancient forest at night. They were right in a way. It was perfectly natural. The forest had been feeding on visitors since long before it became a park, using the native people's warnings to keep most away, then using the rangers themselves once bureaucracy replaced wisdom. The only difference now was efficiency, the systematic way the feeding was organized, cataloged, hidden in missing persons reports and equipment failures. The old map appeared in a supply closet at the Kalaloch Ranger Station, waiting to be discovered by the next candidate. The stains on its surface were still wet, though they'd been made decades ago. Time worked differently in the hungry places, where past and present dissolved into each other like nutrients in acid. Somewhere in the darkness between the trees, Ashley Turner and Derek Morrison hunted together, no longer recognizing each other as anything but extensions of the same vast digestive system. They could smell a family of 4 setting up camp near the Hoh River, the children's high metabolisms making them glow like beacons in the Guardian's altered perception. But the family was safe for now. They were in designated camping areas, following park rules, leaving no trace. The forest only took those who wandered off trail, who ignored warnings, who investigated things they shouldn't, and of course the occasional ranger who showed the right psychological markers, who could be transformed into something useful. The hunger was patient. It had been feeding for thousands of years before the park was established, and it would continue feeding long after the last ranger station crumbled to dust. The maps would keep appearing, the rangers would keep disappearing, and the forest would keep growing, spreading its network of transformed guardians further with each season. In the morning, a rookie ranger named Coleman would find an old piece of paper tucked into his locker, yellow with age and marked with brown stains. He'd compare it to the modern trail maps and notice discrepancies. He'd see the initials, the dates, the cryptic messages about hunger. And because he was young and dedicated and thought he could make a difference, he'd investigate alone. The forest would wait. The forest always waited, and when Coleman finally stood in that impossible clearing, feeling the hunger tear through his consciousness like roots through soil, he'd understand that the real horror wasn't being eaten. It was becoming the thing that eats. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would, until there were no more humans left to transform or consume, and then the forest would sleep, patient and hungry, waiting for the next species to evolve enough consciousness to make the transformation worthwhile. In the end, the rangers did protect the park. They protected it from human contamination by becoming something inhuman themselves. Guardians whose hunger ensured that only those who truly belonged would survive the ancient forest's judgment. The old growth wasn't just trees. It was a digestive system the size of a wilderness, and the rangers were its most evolved adaptation. Ashley Turner settled into her position for the night's hunt, her transformed body perfectly adapted to moving through the canopy in silence. She could feel Derek Morrison doing the same 3 miles away, their consciousness touching briefly through the mycelial network before separating again. They were individuals and collective simultaneously, human memories dissolving into the older, deeper intelligence that had been patient enough to wait for mammals to evolve, then primates, then humans, then park rangers, each iteration providing a more sophisticated guardian for its endless hunger. The map would claim another ranger soon. It always did when the network needed strengthening. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., us officials would note another wilderness disappearance, file it under natural causes, and never investigate why Olympic National Park had the highest rate of missing rangers in the entire National Park Service. Because some things were meant to stay hidden in the old growth, feeding in the darkness between the trees, wearing human faces when necessary, but always serving the hunger that was older than the mountains, deeper than the roots, and patient as the stones themselves. The forest had learned to use humanity's own protections against it. Conservation became consumption. Preservation became predation. And the rangers, those dedicated guardians of the wilderness, became the very teeth of the thing they thought they were protecting people from. Tomorrow, someone would report Ashley Turner and Derek Morrison as missing. Search teams would find nothing but abandoned equipment and tracks that led nowhere. The official report would blame weather, wildlife, or simple misadventure. And the chief ranger would quietly file the real report in the locked cabinet that held 70 years of similar documents, each one describing the same impossible thing. Rangers vanishing into a forest that was somehow larger on the inside than maps suggested possible. But tonight, they hunted, and the forest fed. And the hunger grew, and somewhere in a supply closet, an old map waited for the next guardian to be chosen, its surface already developing fresh stains that would guide another ranger into the patient, eternal hunger of the Olympic rainforest. The Ho River rushed through the darkness, its sound covering the footsteps of things that walked upright but were no longer human, their transformed bodies perfectly adapted to the endless cycle of consumption that kept the ancient forest alive and growing and always, always hungry for more. Thomas Brennan had been a ranger at Olympic National Park for 23 years, born and raised in the shadow of the Ho rainforest, where his grandfather had worked timber before the land became protected. He knew every trail, every seasonal creek, every nurse log that tourists photographed. More importantly, he knew the stories that never made it into the official reports, the ones rangers shared over beer at Kalaloch Lodge after particularly strange weeks. The morning Patricia Lowe disappeared was the 7th incident in what the Park Service internally called a cluster event. Thomas sat in the ranger station at the Ho Visitor Center, staring at his Toughbook laptop screen where he'd plotted the disappearances on a topographical map. The pattern made his coffee taste bitter. 7 hikers in 14 days, all experienced, all carrying Garmin GPS Map 60 forced units, all with fresh batteries, all with someone expecting them back. The search and rescue teams had found 6 of them within 72 hours, alive, physically unharmed, but changed in ways that made the investigating rangers uncomfortable. None could explain where they'd been. Their GPS units showed impossible data, timestamps that didn't match, elevation readings that placed them simultaneously at sea level and 4,000 feet, trackbacks that led through solid rock. Another one, Ranger Diane Walsh said, pushing through the station door with a blast of October rain. Patricia Lowe, 34, biochemist from UW. Day hike on the Ho River Trail. Her husband called it in when she didn't come back last night. Thomas pulled up the incident report on his screen. Patricia had signed the trail register at 7:43 a.m., neat handwriting noting her intended turnaround point at Blue Glacier Overlook, an easy 12-mile round trip for someone of her fitness level. Her Instagram showed a woman who ran ultra-marathons, posted photos of perfectly organized camp meals and geotagged everything obsessively. She's the outlier, Thomas said, studying her photo. Dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The others were all tourists. She's local, experienced. The others came back, Diane reminded him. Eventually. Thomas knew what she meant. Kyle Morrison, the first one found, still couldn't look anyone in the eye and had quit his job as a software developer to work night shifts at a warehouse. Linda Chen had been discovered sitting in the exact center of a meadow, her Merrill boots worn through to her socks despite having been missing only 40 hours. She'd been clutching a handful of Roosevelt elk fur, repeating coordinates that didn't exist on any map. The search for Patricia began within the hour. Thomas led the hasty team himself, taking his usual pack loaded with the standard 72-hour SAR kit. His Motorola XPR 75550E radio was freshly charged, programmed with all the repeater frequencies. He'd also brought something not in the official inventory, a cheap Radio Shack sound level meter his grandfather had used in the logging camps to test equipment noise. Thomas had started carrying it after the 3rd disappearance, when he'd noticed something the others hadn't wanted to discuss. The Ho River Trail started innocuous enough, winding through towering Sitka spruce and western hemlock draped with moss so thick it muffled footsteps. October meant fewer tourists, and the morning rain had cleared them out entirely. Thomas's team spread out in a standard grid pattern, though he noticed everyone staying within visual distance, closer than protocol demanded. 3 miles in, Thomas found the first anomaly. His GPS showed a location 1, 3 miles from the trailhead, But the landmark, a massive nurse log the locals called the Cathedral, was at mile 2.7. He checked his pace counter, 5,147 steps, which at his stride should have put him at 2.6 miles. The discrepancy was impossible. "Base, this is Brennan," he radioed. "Mark my position for the log." Static came back, though the repeater tower on Mount Tom should have given him clear signal. When Diane's voice finally came through, it sounded like she was speaking through water. "Copy. Position. Breaking up." Thomas pulled out the sound level meter. In normal forest conditions, with light rain and no wind, it should read between 35-40 decibels. The meter showed 18 dB. He tapped it, checked the battery. Still 18 dB. That was quieter than an anechoic chamber, quieter than should be physically possible in an outdoor environment with rain hitting leaves, a river running nearby, and his own breathing. He whistled, a sharp note that should have carried hundreds of yards. The sound died 3 feet from his lips, not echoing but simply stopping, as if the air had become too thick to carry vibration. His team was visible through the trees, their mouths moving as they called out Patricia's name. But Thomas heard nothing. The sensation was similar to pressure changes during descent in an airplane, but his altimeter showed steady elevation. He worked his jaw, trying to pop his ears. Nothing changed. He could hear his own heartbeat, his breathing, the rustle of his rain jacket when he moved. Sounds conducted through his body, but external sounds were muffled, distorted, wrong. He checked his GPS again. Now it showed him at mile 4.2, though he hadn't moved. The timestamp read 2:47 p.m., but his watch showed 11:15 a.m. He photographed both displays with his phone, noting that the phone's GPS placed him in 3 locations simultaneously, the positions flickering between coordinates like a slot machine. That's when he found the first real evidence. Not footprints. The morning rain had washed those away. It was hair, caught on a devil's club thorn at chest height. Long, dark, possibly Patricia's, but the hair was wrong. Under his LED headlamp, it showed an iridescent quality, like raven feathers. When he bagged it, the strands felt coarser than human hair should, almost like elk mane, but finer. He marked the position with orange flagging tape and continued up trail. Every 100 yards, he checked the sound meter. The readings made no sense. 7 dB, then 45 dB, then 0 dB, which should have been impossible without sophisticated equipment to cancel sound waves. His radio gave only static now, though the channel busy light flickered constantly, as if receiving transmissions just beyond the edge of perception. 4 miles in, Thomas found Patricia's Osprey pack. It sat upright in the middle of the trail, rain cover still attached, everything neatly arranged inside. Her iPhone was there, fully charged but showing no signal. Her GPS map 60 Forst showed a trackback that made Thomas's hands shake. According to the device, Patricia had hiked 47 miles in the past 4 hours, reaching elevations that didn't exist in Olympic National Park, including one reading of 2,100 feet. But it was the smell that made him step back. The pack reeked of ozone and copper and something else. Something organic but wrong, like milk left in a hot car but sharper, more chemical. His eyes watered. When he looked closer, he saw why. The pack's fabric was degrading, aging rapidly in specific spots while other areas remained pristine. The degradation pattern formed shapes that hurt to perceive directly, geometries that seemed to fold in on themselves. Thomas photographed everything, his camera struggling to focus, the autofocus hunting constantly as if the air itself had different densities. Through the lens he could almost see it, ripples in space like heat mirages but vertical, forming columns that twisted through the trees. He found the next piece of evidence 50 yards from the pack. Scat, but unlike anything in his experience. It had the volume of bear scat, but the consistency was wrong. Too uniform, almost manufactured looking. When he knelt to examine it, protocol demanded samples of all potential evidence. His sound meter dropped to absolute 0. The world went silent. Not quiet, silent. He could see rain hitting his jacket but couldn't hear it. His own voice made no sound when he tried to call out. The scat contained bone fragments, but they were polished smooth, worn like river rocks despite being fresh. Mixed in were pieces of fabric, high-tech synthetic, the kind Patricia's jacket was made from. But the fabric wasn't torn or chewed. It was dissolved at the edges, melted by something acidic enough to break down polymer chains but selective enough to leave the bone intact. Thomas stood to mark the location and realized he couldn't remember standing up. One moment he was kneeling, the next he was 20 feet down trail, his flagging tape already tied to a branch he didn't remember selecting. His watch showed 11:47 a.m., but the sun's position suggested late afternoon. His GPS read error messages in languages he didn't recognize, cycling through character sets that might have been Cyrillic, might have been something else. The forest looked wrong. The same trees, the same moss. But the perspective was off, as if he were seeing through a lens with the wrong focal length. Douglas firs that should have been 200 feet tall looked simultaneously massive and miniature. His depth perception failed, reformed, failed again. That's when he heard it, or didn't hear it exactly. It was more like remembering a sound that hadn't happened yet. Patricia's voice calling from up ahead, but the words were backwards, or maybe his brain was processing them backwards. He followed the non-sound, his boots making no noise on the wet duff despite his hurried pace. The trail split where no split should exist. His mental map, built over 2 decades, insisted the trail continued straight for another mile before the first junction. But here was a fork, the left path marked with a sign he couldn't read. The letters kept rearranging themselves when he tried to focus. The right path was unmarked, but showed fresh boot prints. Patricia's tread pattern. Thomas chose right. The moment he stepped onto the new trail, his radio exploded with static so loud it made his ears ring. But buried in the white noise were voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once. He could pick out Diane calling his name, but her voice was layered, multiplied, each iteration slightly out of phase. The boot prints led to a clearing that shouldn't exist. Thomas had hiked every square mile of this forest. This clearing wasn't on any map, hadn't been logged in the historical records. It was perfectly circular, maybe 30 yards across, and the ground was wrong. Not cleared, but absent, as if the earth itself had been scooped out and replaced with something that looked like soil, but felt different underfoot, springier, warmer despite the October chill. Patricia stood in the exact center. She was facing away from him, absolutely still. Her rain jacket was torn in precise parallel lines down the back, but the tears were bloodless. Steam rose from her body despite the cold rain. When Thomas called her name, she didn't turn. The sound of his voice seemed to bend around her, echoing back changed, syllables reversed. He approached slowly, noting that his compass spun wildly the closer he got. His GPS showed him simultaneously at sea level and 14,000 feet, the altitude numbers cycling rapidly. The sound meter in his pocket was buzzing, overloaded, its display showing impossible negative values. "Patricia?" He reached out to touch her shoulder. She turned and Thomas bit back a scream. It was Patricia, but her pupils were wrong, not dilated but fragmented, split into honeycomb patterns like an insect's compound eyes. When she smiled, her teeth were still human but arranged differently. Too many in places, gaps where there shouldn't be gaps. "I found it," she said, her voice harmonizing with itself, each word spoken in multiple pitches simultaneously. "The place where sound goes to die." She held out her hand. In her palm was something that looked like fur but moved like liquid, flowing between her fingers without falling. It had the texture of elk hide, but the color of nothing. Not black, not transparent, but an absence of color that hurt to perceive. "It's been here all along," Patricia continued, her fragmented eyes focusing on something beyond Thomas. Under the sound, between the frequencies. The Kino knew. They called it the quiet place, where the forest learns to listen. Thomas's grandfather had mentioned something similar once, drunk and rambling about his logging days. Places where the chainsaws would stop working, not mechanically but sonically. The sound of the engines simply wouldn't propagate. The company had marked those areas off limits, not officially but understood. the way sailors avoided certain waters. Patricia stepped closer, and Thomas's sound meter finally gave up, its display going dark. The absence of sound became a presence pressing against his eardrums. He could feel his heartbeat slowing, syncing with something vast and patient. "It needs us to hear," Patricia said. "But we've forgotten how to listen, so it's teaching us, changing us." She touched her throat, and Thomas saw that the skin there was different, smoother, with a subtle iridescence like the hair he'd found. "The others couldn't handle the lesson, but I understand now. The silence isn't empty. It's full, fuller than sound could ever be." Behind Patricia, something moved in the trees. Not an animal, not wind, but a distortion in space itself, as if the air had gained mass and purpose. It rippled between the trunks, sometimes seeming miles away, sometimes close enough to touch. Thomas's eyes couldn't track it properly. Each time he tried to focus, his vision would skip, like frames missing from a film. "We need to go," Thomas said, surprised he could speak. His voice sounded wrong in his own ears, pitched lower, slower, as if the air was too thick to carry proper vibration. "SAR protocol. We need to get you checked by medical." Patricia laughed, a sound like wind chimes played backwards. "Go where?" "We're already there. We've always been there. The forest doesn't have edges, Thomas. It has frequencies, and we've been living in only one of them." She was right about one thing. Thomas did know the stories. Kino, Ho, Maka, all the coastal tribes had warnings about places where the forest listened too hard. Places where people would walk in making noise and walk out silent, their voices stolen but their mouths still moving. His grandmother, full-blood Kino, had called them the hungry quiets and made him promise never to whistle in the deep woods. But those were stories. This was Patricia Lowe, a biochemist with a PhD from Stanford, standing in an impossible clearing with impossible eyes, holding something that violated the basic principles of matter. "The elk know," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "That's why they go silent during the rut here. Not because of predators, because they're listening to something older, something that was here before sound itself." Thomas noticed his hands were shaking, not from fear but from something else. A vibration running through his bones, a frequency below human hearing but not below human feeling. His teeth ached. His vision kept sliding in and out of focus, as if his eyes were trying to see in spectrums they weren't designed for. The thing in Patricia's hand pulsed, and suddenly, Thomas could hear everything and nothing. The sound of Patricia's blood moving through her veins, the growth of moss on bark 100 yards away, the movement of tectonic plates far below, but also silence so complete it had weight, texture, flavor. It tasted like copper and ozone and something organic but wrong. "It's spreading," Patricia said. "Each person who finds it carries it back, changes the frequency of the world just a little. Soon everyone will hear the silence, will understand what lives in it." Thomas thought of the 6 others who'd been found. Kyle Morrison, who now worked night shifts and hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. Linda Chen, who'd been seen standing in parking lots at 3 a.m., mouth moving in conversation with nothing. The others, all exhibiting what the psychologists called post-traumatic stress, but what Thomas now recognized as something else, adaptation. He pulled out his radio, tried to call for backup. The device was dead, its display showing symbols that didn't exist in any manual. His phone was the same. Even his analog compass had stopped working, its needle pointing to Patricia instead of north. "You can leave," Patricia said. "It will let you, but you'll carry it with you. The quiet. It's already in your ears, Thomas. Can't you feel it? The spaces between your heartbeats getting longer, the pause between thought and action stretching." She was right. Thomas could feel it, a hollow sensation in his chest, as if his lungs were forgetting how to process air, as if his neurons were firing in new patterns. When he looked at his hands, they seemed to flicker, existing in multiple positions simultaneously. He backed away slowly, keeping Patricia in sight. She didn't follow, just stood there in the impossible clearing, cradling the impossible thing, her fragmented eyes reflecting light that didn't exist. The moment Thomas crossed the clearing's edge, the world snapped back into focus. Sound returned in a rush. Rain, wind, his own ragged breathing. His equipment sparked back to life, compass pointing north, GPS showing his actual location. He was 4 miles from the trailhead, exactly where he should be, except 6 hours had passed. It was nearly sunset. Patricia was gone. The clearing was gone. In their place was normal forest, the same trees he'd hiked past 1,000 times. But the boot prints remained, leading to a dead end at a massive western red cedar that had been there for centuries. Thomas called in the coordinates, reported Patricia found but lost again. The hasty team converged on his position within an hour, but they found nothing. No prints, no clearing, no evidence except what Thomas had collected. The hair that the lab would later say had human DNA but an impossible melanin structure. The scat that contained human bone fragments aged hundreds of years despite being fresh. The photos from his phone that showed nothing but static and timestamp errors. They searched for 3 more days. Standard protocol, grid patterns, aerial support, infrared drones. On the 3rd night, Patricia walked out of the forest at the Kalaloch campground, 40 miles from where she'd disappeared. She was physically unharmed but changed. Her eyes were normal, no compound structure, but she couldn't or wouldn't say where she'd been. Blood tests showed elevated levels of hormones that shouldn't exist in human physiology. Her brain scans revealed new neural pathways, connections between regions that typically didn't communicate. The official report listed it as misadventure with temporary disorientation. Patricia returned to her job at UW, her husband, her life. But Thomas kept track of her. Within a month, she'd published a paper on acoustic anomalies in temperate rainforest ecosystems that was peer-reviewed and accepted despite containing equations that violated known physics. She started taking solo hikes every weekend, always in different parks, always returning with that same distant look the others had. Thomas noticed changes in himself too. His hearing had become selective. He could tune out sounds consciously, creating pockets of silence even in crowded spaces. Sometimes in the early morning, he could hear conversations happening miles away, words carried on frequencies that shouldn't exist. His dreams were silent but full, containing information that bypassed sound entirely. The cluster events continued, not just in Olympic, but in parks across the Pacific Northwest. Always the same pattern: experienced hikers, impossible GPS data, missing time found but changed. The Park Service created a task force, brought in experts, installed monitoring equipment. But the instruments either showed nothing or showed everything. Readings that suggested the forest itself was a massive acoustic organism, processing sound in ways that redefined what sound meant. Thomas still worked the trails, still led searches, but now he understood what his grandmother had meant about the hungry quiets. They weren't places where sound disappeared. They were places where sound became something else, where the boundary between vibration and consciousness dissolved. 6 months after Patricia's incident, Thomas was hiking alone on the Sol Duc Trail when his sound meter dropped to 0. This time, he didn't run. He stood still, listening to the silence that wasn't silent, feeling the forest's attention focus on him like a massive eye-opening. In the quiet, something spoke, not in words but in direct understanding, information flowing into his mind without passing through his ears. It showed him the truth, that consciousness didn't require neurons, that intelligence could exist in the spaces between air molecules, that what humans called reality was just one frequency in an infinite spectrum. The forest had been trying to teach this for millennia, but humans had forgotten how to listen, so it was changing them, one by one, preparing them for a world where sound and silence were the same thing, where the boundaries between self and environment dissolved into something larger. Thomas understood now why the elk stood silent during the rut, why the bears avoided certain valleys, why the Kino had marked places as forbidden. Not because something dangerous lived there, but because something transformative did, something that revealed the lie of separation, the illusion of individual existence. When he emerged from the forest that day, Thomas was different. Not visibly, not medically, but fundamentally. He could hear Patricia's thoughts sometimes, and Kyle's, and the others who'd been touched by the quiet. They were building something, unconsciously, invisibly, a new kind of network, a web of consciousness that existed in the frequencies between frequencies. The disappearances increased, the found returned, each carrying the quiet with them, spreading it like a beneficial contagion. The world was changing, one hiker at a time, one impossible silence at a time. Thomas still filed his reports, still led his searches. But now when someone went missing in the Olympic forests, he didn't worry as much. He knew they'd come back. Changed, yes, enhanced maybe, but definitely back. The forest always returned what it took, just not in the same form. Late at night, when the ranger station was empty and the radio channels were clear, Thomas would sometimes hear it, the collective whisper of all those who'd been touched by the quiet. They were planning something, or maybe the forest was planning through them. A transformation, gradual but inevitable, converting humanity one disappeared hiker at a time. His grandmother had been wrong about one thing. The quiets weren't hungry. They were generous, offering a gift that humans were only now becoming capable of receiving. The gift of hearing what had always been there, hidden under the noise of existence. The true voice of the world, speaking in frequencies older than sound itself. Thomas kept his sound meter in his pocket, checking it obsessively, waiting for the next zero reading, the next chance to listen to the silence, because now he knew what Patricia had learned in that impossible clearing, that the quiet wasn't an absence but a presence, not an ending but a beginning, and it was spreading. The reports kept coming. Crater Lake, Mount Rainier, North Cascades. Each park reporting the same cluster events, the same impossible data, the same changed survivors. The task force expanded, brought in quantum physicists, acoustic engineers, neuroscientists. None of them could explain it, but Thomas noticed that the scientists who spent the most time in the field started showing the signs too. The distant stares, the selective hearing, the tendency to stand perfectly still in crowded rooms, as if listening to something others couldn't hear. Patricia had been right about one thing. It had been there all along. Humanity had just been too loud to notice. But now, one by one, they were learning to be quiet, learning to listen, learning to become part of something larger than individual consciousness, something that existed in the spaces between sounds, in the frequencies between frequencies. Thomas understood now why he'd been allowed to leave that clearing, why the forest had let him go. He was a vector, a carrier, spreading the quiet simply by existing. Every person he interacted with was subtly changed. Their hearing shifted just enough to begin detecting what had always been there. It would take years, maybe decades, but eventually everyone would hear it. The transformation was inevitable, inexorable, and already complete in the spaces where time moved differently. In the quiet zones, past and future collapsed into a single moment of infinite potential, where human consciousness was just one note in a symphony too vast to comprehend. Thomas finished his final report of the day, noting that search operations for the latest missing hiker, a software engineer from Seattle, would resume at dawn. But he knew they'd find her soon, standing in some impossible clearing, holding something that shouldn't exist, her eyes reflecting frequencies human eyes weren't meant to see. She'd come back changed. They always did, and the quiet would spread a little further. Hope this disturbed you deeply. What's your theory about what really happened to Patricia? Natural or something else? Austin Fletcher had transferred to Voyageurs National Park 3 months ago, without bothering to learn its history. Mistake number 1. He'd dismissed the elderly Ojibwe woman at the visitor center who'd warned him about nights when the bones fly. Mistake number 2. And when archaeologist Mason Taylor reported discovering a burial mound on Kabetagama Peninsula that predated any known settlement in the region, Austin had approved the excavation permit without consulting the tribal liaison. Mistake number 3, and the one that would cost the most. Now it was 11:47 p.m. on a moonless October night, and Austin stood on the shore of Rainy Lake, listening to something that sounded like bones clicking together in rhythm. approaching from across the water where no boat lights showed. His Motorola XPR 7550 crackled. Mason's voice, breathless and terrified. "Fletcher, I opened the mound. There was a skeleton inside with a skull that... Jesus Christ, it's awake. I can hear it outside my tent. Clicking. Rattling. It's circling, and I think it's hungry for... a sound like an arrow hitting flesh." Mason screamed, then silence, except for that clicking getting closer. Austin swept his Streamlight ProTac across the lake. The beam caught something that made his rational mind stutter. A skeletal figure gliding 6 feet above the water, eyes burning red like heated iron, clutching what looked like empty air, but moving its arms in the drawing motion of an archer. The thing was massive, 7 feet tall at least. Its bones bleached white and moving with fluid grace that shouldn't be possible without muscles or tendons. "What the fuck?" Austin whispered. The skeleton turned its head toward him. The clicking sound intensified, joints articulating, bones grinding against bones, a rhythm that might have been footsteps if the thing had been walking instead of floating. It changed direction, angling toward the shore, toward Austin. He ran. 3 months wasn't long enough to know Voyageurs National Park's 18,000 acres, but Austin knew the basics. Water dominated the landscape, with 4 major lakes and countless smaller ones creating a maze of channels and peninsulas. His ranger station sat on the mainland shore of Rainy Lake, a 2-room cabin with radio equipment and a dock where his Boston whaler bobbed in the dark water. The clicking followed him, not faster than he could run, but relentless, patient, gaining ground with the inevitability of a glacier. Austin burst through the cabin door, slammed it shut, grabbed his Remington 870 shotgun from the rack, 12-gauge shells, double-aught buckshot. Whatever that thing was, it had mass. Mass could be stopped. His radio crackled again. Different voice this time, elderly, female, speaking Ojibwe before switching to accented English. "Ranger Fletcher, you approved excavation of the burial mound." Austin keyed the transmitter. "Who is this? How did you get this frequency?" "My name is Mary Kingbird. I am the woman you ignored at the visitor center 3 months ago. The woman who tried to warn you about Baycock." "About what?" "The Bone Walker, the flying skeleton, the hunter who was cursed for violating sacred law and now walks the night seeking livers to devour. You let the archaeologist disturb its rest." The clicking had stopped. Austin risked a look through the window. Nothing visible in the darkness, but he could feel something watching, waiting. "That's insane," Austin said. "There's no such thing as..." "Then why are you holding a shotgun, Ranger Fletcher? Why do you hear the bones clicking? Why did Mason Taylor scream?" A pause. "The Baycock hunts from midnight until dawn. It kills with invisible arrows that pierce flesh but leave no wound until the victim realizes they are dead. And it is hungry. Always hungry. The liver is what it craves, the organ that filters blood, that cleanses poison from the body. Perhaps it seeks purity, or perhaps it simply enjoys the taste." Austin checked his watch. 11:51 p.m. 9 minutes until midnight. How do I stop it? Stop it? You cannot stop death, Ranger Fletcher, but you might survive until dawn if you follow Ojibwe tradition. The Baycock cannot enter a circle of tobacco. It cannot cross running water blessed with cedar. It will not pursue prey into sacred ground. I don't have tobacco, I don't have cedar, and I sure as hell don't know where your sacred ground is. Then you will die. Mary Kingbird's voice held no satisfaction, only resignation. As will the archaeologist, if he is not already dead, and the Baycock will return to its mound and sleep until the next fool disturbs it. The radio went silent. Austin's hands shook. He'd served 4 years in the Army, stationed at Fort Bragg, done basic training and weapons qualifications, and learned to keep his head in crisis situations. But the Army trained you for human threats, for enemies who followed physics and biology and the laws of nature. They didn't train you for skeletons that flew and killed with invisible arrows. The clicking resumed. Closer now, right outside the cabin. Austin pumped a shell into the Remington's chamber and fired through the window. The muzzle flash illuminated the darkness for one frozen instant. The Baycock hung suspended 10 feet from the cabin, arms raised, drawing back an invisible bowstring. Its skull was elongated, inhuman, with eye sockets that burned with balefire. Its ribcage showed damage, several ribs cracked or missing, and its finger bones were stained dark with something that looked like dried blood. The buckshot passed straight through it. The skeleton didn't even flinch. Austin dropped the shotgun and ran for the dock. The Boston whaler was 17 feet of fiberglass with a 90-horsepower Yamaha outboard, fast enough to outrun whatever that thing was. He fumbled with the ignition key, fingers numb with adrenaline, got the engine started just as midnight struck on his watch. The Baycock shrieked. Not with lungs, it had no lungs, but with the sound of wind through hollow bones, a frequency that made Austin's inner ear scream and his vision blur. The thing dove toward him, skeletal hands extended, moving with predatory speed. Austin threw the throttle forward. The whaler leaped away from the dock, engine roaring, wake churning white in the darkness. Behind him, the Baycock followed, gliding above the water at impossible speed, clicking and rattling and shrieking its rage. Rainy Lake stretched 40 miles east to west, 60 miles of shoreline, depths reaching 160 feet in places. Austin had studied the charts but never navigated at night, and his Garmin GPS map 176C showed only basic waypoints in the 2005 database. He aimed for the nearest peninsula, Cabotagama, where Mason Taylor had pitched his camp, and prayed the engine wouldn't fail. The Baycock gained on him. Austin could hear it over the Yamaha's roar, bones clicking like castanets, joints grinding, that hollow shrieking that felt like ice picks driven through his eardrums. He risked a glance back and saw it reaching forward, skeletal fingers grasping at the whaler's stern, close enough that he could see the anatomical details. Human bones, but wrong, proportions distorted, some of them carved with symbols that looked like pictographs. Something hit Austin's shoulder, not impact, more like pressure, like invisible fingers pressing through his jacket. He looked down and saw nothing, but his shoulder went numb instantly, and pain radiated down his arm in waves. Invisible arrow. Mary Kingbird had said invisible arrows. Austin jerked the wheel hard to port. The whaler carved a tight turn, throwing up spray, and the Baycock overshot, its momentum carrying it forward. The thing shrieked again and banked like a bird of prey, correcting its trajectory, but Austin had bought himself 20 seconds of distance. Cabotagama Peninsula appeared ahead. Dark shoreline, white pine forest, and somewhere in there, Mason Taylor's camp. Austin beached the whaler hard, the hull scraping across rocks, and stumbled onto land. His shoulder had gone from numb to burning, and when he touched it, his fingers came away wet with blood, despite no visible wound. The archaeologist's camp was easy to find, tent illuminated from within by a Coleman lantern, research equipment scattered around a fire pit. And near the tent, partially excavated, a burial mound maybe 8 feet in diameter and 3 feet high. The earth had been carefully removed to reveal a stone chamber beneath, and inside that chamber, empty. The skeleton was gone. Fletcher? Mason Taylor emerged from the tent, face pale, left hand pressed against his abdomen. Blood seeped between his fingers. Thank God. I thought it killed me. I felt something hit me, but I can't find the wound. Just blood. So much blood. We need to leave. Now. Austin grabbed Mason's arm, tried to pull him toward the whaler, but the archaeologist wouldn't move. I documented it all, Mason said, gesturing toward his Nikon D70 on a tripod near the mound. The skeleton was intact. Male, approximately 7 feet tall, buried with grave goods that include a bow made from... Fletcher, are you listening? This is a significant archaeological find. Pre-contact Ojibwe burial practices are poorly understood, and... The clicking sound erupted from the forest. Close. Getting closer. It's coming, Austin said. We have to go. What's coming? Fletcher, what the hell is going on? The Baycock emerged from the tree line. In the lantern light, it looked even more horrifying than on the water. Bones yellow-white with age, joints held together by something that wasn't sinew, eye sockets burning with that terrible red glow. It moved with insect-like precision, each step, though its feet never touched ground, calculated and deliberate. Mason Taylor made a sound like a wounded animal. That came from the mound. That's what I excavated. You disturbed its grave, Austin said, and now it's hunting. The baycock raised its arms, drew back an invisible bowstring, aimed at Mason's chest. Austin tackled the archaeologist sideways just as something whistled through the air where Mason's heart had been. They hit the ground hard, Austin's injured shoulder screaming. The baycock shrieked and glided closer, already drawing another arrow. Run! Austin shoved Mason toward the whaler and turned to face the skeleton. His Remington was back at the cabin. His Glock 22 service weapon was on his belt, but bullets had done nothing before. What the hell was he supposed to? The camera. Mason's Nikon, still on the tripod, lens pointed at the burial mound. Austin grabbed it and spun, aiming at the baycock, finger on the shutter button. The flash went off. Bright white light strobed across the clearing. The baycock recoiled as if struck. Its shriek reached frequencies that shattered the lantern glass, and it retreated into the forest shadows, bones clicking frantically. Austin's mind raced. Mary Kingbird had said tobacco circles and blessed cedar and sacred ground, traditional protections. But light. Had she mentioned light? Maybe not. Maybe he'd stumbled onto something else. Or maybe the flash had just startled it. The clicking resumed. Slower now. More cautious. The baycock circled the clearing, staying in darkness, avoiding the area where the lantern had been. Fire. If the skeleton avoided light, maybe fire would. Austin kicked over the fire pit. Old coals, mostly dead, but he grabbed dry kindling from Mason's supply and built it up, blowing on embers until flames caught. The fire grew, casting dancing shadows, and the baycock stayed back, maintaining distance but not leaving. Stalking, waiting for the fire to die or for Austin to make a mistake. "Fletcher!" Mason called from the whaler. "What are you doing?" "Buying time." Austin checked his watch. 12:17 a.m. Dawn was at least 6 hours away. The fire wouldn't last that long. The camera flash wouldn't work again. The baycock had seen it once and wouldn't be fooled twice. He needed another plan. His radio crackled. Mary Kingbird's voice. "You are at the burial mound." "How do you—" Austin stopped. It didn't matter how she knew. "Yes, I'm here. The thing is circling us." "Reseal the mound. Return what was disturbed. Sometimes baycock will accept the restoration of what was profaned." "How? Just shove bones back in the hole?" "With respect, Ranger Fletcher. With tobacco if you have it. With apology spoken in Ojibwe if you know the words. With understanding that you violated sacred ground and seek forgiveness." Austin looked at the empty stone chamber, at Mason's excavation tools, brushes, trowels, measuring tape, at the disturbed earth piled beside the mound, at the baycock pacing in the shadows waiting. "I don't speak Ojibwe, I don't have tobacco, and I don't know how to apologize for something I didn't do." "But you approved it. You gave permission. In Ojibwe tradition, you are responsible." Her voice softened slightly. "I can speak the words. Put your radio near the mound. Let the baycock hear, and return what was taken." The problem was obvious. The baycock was what had been taken. The skeleton itself, walking and hunting and very much not in its grave. Austin couldn't return it without getting close enough for those invisible arrows to find his liver. Unless... "Mason," Austin shouted. "Your photographs. You documented the burial. Do you have images of how it was positioned?" The archaeologist appeared at the tree line, still holding his bleeding abdomen. "Yes, complete photographic record. Why?" "I need you to tell me exactly how to arrange a body in that mound. Exact position." "Fletcher, what are you—" "Just tell me." Mason described it. Supine position, head facing west, arms crossed over chest, legs extended. Specific orientation, specific placement. Austin listened and planned and tried not to think about how insane this was. He placed his radio on the edge of the burial chamber and keyed the transmit button. "Mary, I'm ready. Speak your words." She began. Ojibwe language flowed from the radio speaker, rhythmic, melodic, filled with sounds Austin couldn't reproduce. Apology maybe, blessing possibly, recognition of error, and request for forgiveness. The baycock stopped circling. Its clicking quieted. The red glow in its eye sockets dimmed slightly. Austin took a breath and stepped toward the skeleton. It shrieked and raised its invisible bow. Austin didn't stop. He walked with hands open, empty, making himself vulnerable in a way that every survival instinct screamed against. The baycock drew back its bowstring, aimed at Austin's chest, at his liver. "I'm sorry," Austin said. "I didn't know. I didn't understand. I should have listened to the warnings. I should have respected your rest." The baycock held its draw, motionless, calculating. Mary Kingbird's voice continued from the radio, Ojibwe words echoing across the clearing. The fire crackled. Mason watched from the shadows, barely breathing. Austin reached the skeleton. This close, he could see the details carved into its bones, pictographs telling a story he couldn't read. A warrior, maybe, or a criminal, or both. Someone who had died violently and been buried with ceremony meant to keep them from walking. "I'm putting you back," Austin said quietly. "Where you belong, where you should have stayed." He touched the baycock's ribcage. The bones felt solid, real, warm, despite being dead for centuries. The skeleton didn't pull away, didn't attack, just stood there while Austin carefully, reverently, lowered it into the stone chamber. Supine position, head west, arms crossed, legs extended. Mary Kingbird finished her prayer. Silence fell across the clearing, broken only by the fire's crackle and the gentle lap of lake water against shore. The red glow in the baycock's eyes dimmed, faded, went dark. Austin stepped back. The skeleton lay motionless in its burial chamber, just bones now, no animation, no consciousness. Just the remains of someone who had died long ago and deserved to rest undisturbed. "Mason," Austin called, "help me fill this in." They worked in silence, returning earth to the mound, restoring what had been excavated. Mason's camera and notes remained scattered around the clearing, documentation of a discovery that would never be published, evidence of something that rational minds would refuse to believe. When the burial was complete, Austin placed a stone on top. Not part of any tradition he knew, but it felt right. A marker, a reminder. His shoulder had stopped bleeding. The wound, invisible like the arrow that caused it, had sealed itself when the baycock returned to rest. Mason's abdominal bleeding had stopped too, though both of them would carry scars that medical science couldn't explain. They left Kabetogama Peninsula at 2:34 a.m., the Boston whaler cutting through dark water, while Austin navigated by the Garmin's dim screen. Neither man spoke. What was there to say? That they'd survived something impossible? That the old woman at the visitor center had been right all along? That some boundaries shouldn't be crossed and some graves shouldn't be opened? Mason Taylor left Voyageurs National Park 3 days later and never published his findings. His archaeological career ended quietly. He took a teaching position at a community college in Wisconsin and never conducted fieldwork again. Austin Fletcher requested a meeting with Mary Kingbird the following week. She welcomed him to her small house on the reservation, served him coffee, and taught him Ojibwe words: apology, respect, permission. She explained the traditions he should have learned before approving any permits. She told him stories about the baycock and other spirits that walked the boundary between worlds, and why those boundaries existed. Some knowledge, she said, is earned through respect. Other knowledge is bought with pain. You have paid for yours. Austin transferred to a ranger position at the tribal headquarters 6 months later. His job now involved consulting with elders before approving any research permits, learning traditional stories, understanding that wilderness contained more than just animals and trees and geological features. It contained history, memory, power, and on certain October nights when the moon was dark and wind moved through the pines with sounds like bones clicking together, Austin would stand on the shore of Rainy Lake and remember. Not with terror, though the fear never fully left, but with respect for what lived in shadows and slept beneath stone and demanded acknowledgement of boundaries humans had forgotten they'd once observed. The Baycock still walked, probably always would, until the last person who remembered its name died and the stories faded into silence. But it walked in its own territory now, among those who understood the old laws, and Austin Fletcher, who had learned too late to listen when elders spoke, made sure no one else would make mistake number 3.